The Zero came out of nowhere, streaking through the dawn haze like a silver ghost. I ducked behind the Bofors mount as machine gun fire chewed up the deck plating where I'd been standing 3 seconds earlier. My hand shook as I grabbed another ammunition clip. The twin 40mm barrels of our gun already swinging to track the Japanese fighter as it banked hard to port. Around me, the entire task force erupted in a symphony of anti-aircraft fire, tracers painting bright lines across the gray Philippine sky, 5-inch guns booming like thunder, and the distinctive thump-thump-thump of dozens of Bofors guns creating a steel curtain between us and death. This was October 25, 1944, and we were fighting for our lives in the largest naval battle in history. The Japanese had thrown everything they had at us. 4 separate fleets converging on Leyte Gulf in a desperate gambit to crush MacArthur's invasion of the Philippines. For 3 days now, we'd been locked in a death struggle that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. And I was just one gunner among thousands, manning a Swedish-designed anti-aircraft gun on the escort carrier Gambier Bay, trying to keep the kamikazes from turning our flight deck into twisted metal. But let me back up. Let me tell you how we got here, and how a farm boy from Iowa found himself staring down the entire Japanese combined fleet. What matters is that 3 months earlier, I'd been loading shells into this same Bofors gun during the pre-invasion bombardment of Saipan, and now here we were, supporting the biggest Allied landing since Normandy. General MacArthur had finally returned to the Philippines, just like he'd promised, and our little escort carrier was part of the massive fleet making it possible. The Gambier Bay wasn't much to look at, a converted merchant hull that could barely make 17 knots on a good day. We called her a jeep carrier because she was small and slow, but she carried 28 planes and had enough firepower to support troops on the beaches. Our Wildcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers had been flying close air support missions for the Army boys, fighting their way inland on Leyte Island. Everything had been going according to plan until this morning. I was cleaning the Bofors gun after yesterday's air raids when Seaman First Class Thompson came running up from the radio shack, his face white as a sheet. He panted. The lookout spotted masts on the horizon, big ones, Japanese battleships coming fast from the north. My stomach dropped. We all knew the Japanese were planning something. Intelligence had been picking up increased radio traffic for weeks. But battleships? Out here in Leyte Gulf, our nearest heavy ships were Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, and they were supposed to be hundreds of miles north, chasing the Japanese carriers. Within minutes, the general alarm was shrieking across the ship. Admiral Clifton Sprague's voice crackled over the loudspeaker from the flagship Fanshawe Bay. Enemy surface fleet bearing north-northwest, distance 20 miles and closing. All units prepare for surface action. Surface action. In an escort carrier. It was like being told to fight a grizzly bear with a slingshot. I could see them now through the morning haze. The distinctive pagoda masts of Japanese battleships rising like dark towers on the horizon. As they came closer, I counted at least 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and a screen of destroyers. This wasn't a raid. This was the main Japanese battle fleet, and they'd caught us with our pants down. The Gambier Bay began turning into the wind so our aircraft could launch, but I could see it wouldn't be enough. Those Japanese ships were closing at over 25 knots, and their guns could reach out 20 miles. We had maybe 30 minutes before they'd be in range to turn us into scrap metal. That's when Admiral Sprague made the gutsiest call I've ever heard. Instead of running, which is what any sane person would do when facing a fleet 4 times your size, he ordered all units to attack. All destroyers and destroyer escorts conduct torpedo attack immediately. All carriers launch everything that will fly. I watched in amazement as our 3 destroyers, Hull, Heermann, and Johnston, along with the 4 destroyer escorts, turned toward the Japanese fleet like terriers charging a pack of wolves. They were outgunned by a factor of 10 to 1, but they went in anyway, laying smoke and firing torpedoes as fast as they could load them. The Johnston got there first. I could see her through my binoculars, racing toward the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano at flank speed, her 5-inch guns blazing. The cruiser's 8-inch shells were falling all around her, throwing up enormous waterspouts, but somehow she kept going. At 6,000 yards, she fired all 10 of her torpedoes in a single salvo, then turned away in a cloud of smoke. 2 minutes later, the Kumano erupted in a pillar of fire. One of those torpedoes had found its mark, blowing off the cruiser's bow and sending her out of the fight. First blood to us. But the Japanese weren't finished. Not by a long shot. The first air attack came at 0730 hours, just as our destroyers were engaging the Japanese surface fleet. I was feeding ammunition belts into our Bofors gun when someone shouted, "Bandits! Bandits! Bearing 270, Angels 15. I looked up and felt my blood turn to ice. There were at least 50 Japanese aircraft coming at us, Zeros, Vals, and Kates in perfect formation. They'd been launched from the carriers Admiral Halsey was supposed to be engaging up north, but somehow they'd slipped through. All hands air action port. The gunnery officer's voice was steady, professional. Commence firing when targets are within range. Our Bofors gun was one of 12 mounted on the Gambier Bay, each one capable of throwing 40mm high explosive shells at a rate of 160 rounds per minute. In theory, those shells could bring down any aircraft the Japanese had. In practice, hitting a fighter diving at you at 300 miles per hour while your ship was twisting and turning to avoid bombs was like trying to swat flies in a hurricane. The first wave came in from the sun. Classic Japanese tactics. The Vals peeled off in steep dives while the Zeros strafed our flight deck. I could hear the whack, whack, whack of machine gun bullets hitting the steel plating, and somewhere behind me, a man screamed, "Target bearing 285. I shouted to our gun captain, Petty Officer Martinez. He was already cranking the elevation wheel, bringing our twin barrels up to track a diving bomber. The Bofors had a distinctive sound when it fired, a rapid thump, thump, thump that you could feel in your chest. Mixed with the dozens of other guns on our task force, it created a continuous rolling thunder that drowned out everything else. Our first shells burst just ahead of the Val, orange flowers blooming in the sky. The pilot saw them and yanked his stick back, pulling out of his dive early. His bomb fell harmlessly into the sea, throwing up a waterspout 200 yards off our starboard bow. Missed the Martinez cursed, already swinging the gun toward another target. But I could see our fire was having an effect. The Japanese formation was breaking up, pilots taking evasive action instead of pressing their attacks home. A Kate torpedo bomber off our port quarter was trailing smoke and losing altitude fast. Somebody had put a 5-inch shell right through his engine. He ditched into the sea just short of the destroyer Samuel B. Roberts. For 20 minutes, the sky around Taffy 3 was a madhouse of diving aircraft, bursting shells, and tracer fire. Our radar operators were calling out new contacts every few seconds, more Japanese planes coming in from all directions. But somehow, miraculously, not a single bomb or torpedo found its mark on the carriers. When the attack finally ended, we'd shot down 8 Japanese aircraft confirmed, with at least a dozen more probables. The sea around us was littered with wreckage and oil slicks. But there was no time to celebrate. The Japanese surface fleet was still closing, and their guns were getting closer to effective range. At 0800 hours, the battleship Yamato opened fire. The first salvo from the Yamato fell short by about 1,000 yards, but the sound of those 18-inch shells passing overhead was like freight trains flying through the air. Each projectile weighed as much as a small car and could punch through 2 feet of steel armor. If even one of them hit us, the Gambier Bay would simply cease to exist. "Mary and Joseph," whispered Seaman Thompson, who was crouched behind our gun mountain with a fresh ammunition belt. "Those things are big as telephone poles." He wasn't exaggerating. The Yamato and her sister ship Musashi carried the largest naval guns ever put to sea, 18-inch monsters that could throw a shell over 25 miles. And they were accompanied by the Congo and Haruna, both fast battleships with 14-inch guns that were nearly as deadly. Admiral Sprague ordered all carriers to launch everything they had, even if the planes weren't armed properly. Within minutes, our flight deck was a chaos of activity as pilots ran for their aircraft. Wildcats that hadn't been loaded with ammunition took off anyway, hoping to strafe Japanese ships with their machine guns. Avengers loaded with depth charges instead of torpedoes. Whatever we had in the magazine was going up. Our own planes weren't the only ones launching. Every carrier in Taffy 3 was getting aircraft into the air, and Admiral Stump's Taffy 2 group, 40 miles to the south, was vectoring their planes toward the battle. Within an hour, we'd have nearly 200 American aircraft swarming around the Japanese fleet. But first, we had to survive long enough for them to arrive. The Yamato's second salvo straddled the White Plains, throwing up waterspouts that soaked her flight deck. The third salvo was a direct hit on the Gambier Bay, or would have been, if our captain hadn't thrown the helm hard over at the last second. The shells passed so close I could feel the wind of their passage, and they exploded in the water just 50 yards off our starboard side. The concussion knocked me flat and filled the air with splinters of steel and seawater. "Stay on those guns," Martinez shouted. "They're trying to bracket us." Bracketing was the standard naval gunnery technique. Fire salvos on either side of your target, then split the difference with the next round. If the Japanese got our range, we were dead men. But our destroyers were buying us time with their lives. The Johnston was already severely damaged from her torpedo run against the Kumano, but she was still in the fight, engaging the entire Japanese battle line with her 5-inch guns. It was a hopeless mismatch, like a boy with a BB gun attacking a charging bull, but somehow she was making it work. Through my binoculars, I could see Commander Ernest Evans on the Johnston's bridge, calmly giving orders as 14-inch shells from the Congo fell all around his ship. His port engine was out, his after-gun mount was destroyed, and he was listing to starboard, but he kept coming. The Johnston had already fired all her torpedoes, but Evans was using his ship like a giant machine gun, pumping 5-inch shells at the Japanese cruisers as fast as his remaining guns could fire. At 0830, the heavy cruiser Suzuya took 3 direct hits from the Johnston's guns. I could see the explosions from 5 miles away, bright orange flashes followed by towering columns of black smoke. The cruiser slowed and began falling out of formation, her superstructure ablaze. "Scratch one cruiser," somebody shouted from the signal bridge, but the Johnston was paying a terrible price for her defiance. The Yamato had finally found her range, and 18-inch shells were falling around the destroyer like the wrath of God. At 0845, a direct hit destroyed her forward gun mount and killed half her crew. At 0900, another shell took out her bridge, killing Commander Evans and most of his officers. But somehow, impossibly, the Johnston kept fighting. At 0915, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the distinctive whine of Pratt and Whitney radial engines. Our aircraft were arriving over the Japanese fleet, and they were out for blood. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable led the first strike from the Gambier Bay. He had 6 Wildcats and 8 Avengers, none of them properly armed for attacking battleships. But Huxtable had been flying combat missions since Guadalcanal, and he knew how to make the most of what he had. The Wildcats went in first, strafing the Japanese ships to suppress their anti-aircraft fire. I could see them diving through the flak, their 650 caliber machine guns sparkling as they raked the superstructures of the enemy cruisers. It looked suicidal. Those ships were throwing up a curtain of fire that seemed solid enough to walk on, but somehow the Wildcats got through. Then came the Avengers with their improvised loads. Some carried depth charges that had been fused to explode on impact. Others had general-purpose bombs that weren't designed to penetrate heavy armor, but might damage a ship's superstructure. A few had actual torpedoes, but not many. Most of our fish were still sitting in the magazine because there hadn't been time to arm them properly. Lieutenant Jimmy O'Brien's Avenger came boring in on the Yamato from dead ahead, flying so low he was almost skimming the waves. The battleship's entire forward battery opened up on him. The main guns, the secondary guns, and dozens of anti-aircraft weapons all concentrating their fire on one small aircraft. O'Brien held his course. At 500 yards, with tracers filling the air around him like deadly confetti, he dropped his torpedo and pulled up in a climbing turn. The fish ran straight and true, striking the Yamato just forward of her forward turret. The explosion was massive, a towering waterspout that completely obscured the battleship's bow for nearly 30 seconds. When the spray cleared, I could see the Yamato was down by the head and listing slightly to port. O'Brien's torpedo hadn't sunk her, but it had damaged her enough to reduce her speed and throw off her fire control. More aircraft were arriving every minute now. Taffy 2's planes, still 40 miles away when the battle started, were streaming in from the southeast. Even some of Admiral M.C. Kane's Task Force 38 aircraft, recalled from their strikes against Luzon, were beginning to appear. The sky over the Japanese fleet was turning into a hornet's nest. At 0930, Lieutenant Bob Roby's Avenger put a 500-pound bomb right down the smokestack of the heavy cruiser Chikuma. The explosion blew out her boiler rooms and left her dead in the water, black smoke pouring from every opening in her hull. 10 minutes later, Lieutenant Ed Brockmeyer's Wildcat caught the destroyer Michishio with a strafing run that set off her torpedo magazines. She went up like a Roman candle, breaking in half and sinking in less than 3 minutes. But the Japanese weren't giving up. If anything, they were pressing their attack even harder. The Kongo and Haruna had closed to within 8 miles now, and their 14-inch shells were falling uncomfortably close to the carriers. The White Plains took a near miss that buckled her flight deck, and the St. Lo was straddled by a salvo from the Yamato that knocked out her steering gear. At 0945, our luck ran out. The salvo from the heavy cruiser Tone caught us amidships, just aft of the bridge. The first shell punched through our thin armor like it was tissue paper and exploded in the forward engine room. The second hit our ammunition magazine. The world disappeared in a sheet of white flame and a sound like the end of everything. The explosion lifted the entire forward section of the ship about 3 feet and slammed it back down again. Every light on the ship went out, and for a moment, the only sound was the hiss of escaping steam and the crackle of fires. When I could see again, I was lying on the deck behind our Bofors mount, blood trickling from a cut on my forehead. Martinez was unconscious beside me, and Thompson was nowhere to be seen. Our gun was still functional, but the ship was listing badly to port and losing way. "All hands, this is the captain," came the voice over the ship's loudspeakers. Captain Walter Vugue sounded calm, almost conversational. "We've taken severe damage to the engine room and forward magazines. Damage control parties laid to your stations. All gun crews remain at your posts." I helped Martinez to his feet and checked our ammunition supply. We still had about 200 rounds for the Bofors, and as long as the mount could still traverse, we were still in the fight. Through the smoke, I could see Japanese aircraft circling like vultures, waiting for their chance to finish us off. But our own planes were still attacking the Japanese fleet with a fury that bordered on madness. I watched Lieutenant Commander Huxtable's Wildcat make its 4th strafing run on the cruiser Haguro, his machine guns chewing up the ship's bridge and killing several of her officers. An Avenger from the St. Lo caught the destroyer Yamagumo with a perfectly placed torpedo that broke her back and left her sinking by the stern. The Japanese were starting to pay a terrible price for their attack. In addition to the cruisers and destroyers already sunk or damaged, their formation was completely disrupted. Ships were scattered across 10 miles of ocean, many of them firing at shadows or each other in the confusion. Admiral Kurita, commanding the Japanese fleet from the heavy cruiser Yamato, was losing control of the battle. At 1,000 hours, something extraordinary happened. Through my binoculars, I could see signal flags going up on the Japanese flagships. The enemy fleet was turning away. "They're running," someone shouted from the signal bridge. "The bastards are running." It seemed impossible. The Japanese had us outgunned 4-1, and they'd already crippled 2 of our carriers. But the constant air attacks, the fierce resistance of our destroyers, and the confusion of battle had convinced Admiral Kurita that he was facing a much larger force than he actually was. Thinking he was up against Admiral Halsey's fast carriers instead of our little escort carriers, he decided to withdraw before he lost his entire fleet. But even as the Japanese battle line turned north, they kept firing. The Gambier Bay took another hit in her after-engine room, and then another in her aviation gasoline storage. We were dead in the water now, listing 30 degrees to port and down by the head. At 1007, Captain Vugue gave the order I'd been dreading. "All hands abandon ship." I repeat, all hands abandon ship. It has been an honor to serve with you. The water in Leyte Gulf was warm, about 80 degrees, but it was also full of fuel oil from all the damaged ships. The stuff coated everything like black syrup and burned your eyes and throat. I'd managed to grab a life jacket before going over the side, but dozens of men weren't so lucky. The Gambier Bay went down at 10:30, exactly 3 hours after the first Japanese shells fell. She rolled slowly to port, her flight deck going vertical for a moment before she slipped beneath the waves. As she disappeared, I could see our battle flag still flying from her mast, a small bit of defiance that somehow made me proud even as I floated in the oil-covered sea. I wasn't alone in the water. There were about 800 survivors from the Gambier Bay, plus men from the destroyer Johnston and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, both of which had also been sunk. We clustered together in small groups, sharing life jackets and trying to stay afloat. Martinez had made it off the ship, but he'd taken shrapnel in his left leg and was having trouble swimming. Thompson was there too, his face black with oil, but otherwise uninjured. We found a wooden crate that had been blown off the ship and used it as a makeshift raft. "Think they'll come back for us?" Thompson asked, spitting out seawater. Before I could answer, we heard the sound of aircraft engines. For a moment, I thought it might be Japanese planes coming to strafe us in the water. It had happened before, at other battles. But these were American engines, the distinctive sound of Wright Cyclone radials. A flight of 6 Avengers from the White Plains came roaring overhead at about 200 feet, their wings waggling in salute. Behind them came more planes, Wildcats, Hellcats, even some Army P-38s that had flown out from Leyte. They were heading north, chasing the retreating Japanese fleet. The air attacks continued all day. Every time a Japanese ship showed itself on the horizon, American aircraft pounced on it like hawks on a rabbit. The heavy cruiser Suzuya, already damaged by the Johnston's gunfire, took 3 more torpedo hits and sank at 13:20. The destroyer Naoki went down under a hail of bombs and rockets at 14:15. Even the mighty Yamato, pride of the Japanese fleet, was forced to turn back toward Japan with her bow nearly underwater from torpedo damage. By evening, Admiral Kurita's center force, the most powerful naval formation the Japanese had ever assembled, was in full retreat toward the San Bernardino Strait. They'd started the battle with 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. They were limping home with 3 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 6 destroyers. In exchange for sinking 3 of our escort carriers and 2 destroyers, they'd lost over half their fleet. But we'd paid a price too. In addition to the ships, we'd lost 1,130 men killed and over 900 wounded. I'd seen friends die that morning, good men who'd never see home again. Martinez would lose his leg to infection before we were rescued. Thompson would spend 6 months in a hospital with internal injuries from the blast that sunk our ship. We floated in the oil and wreckage for 18 hours before the destroyers found us. By then, dehydration and exhaustion had claimed more lives, but we'd held. Against impossible odds, Taffy 3 had turned back the largest naval attack in Japanese history. The Battle of Leyte Gulf officially ended on October 26, 1944, after 4 days of continuous fighting across an area of ocean larger than the state of Texas. When the smoke cleared and the losses were tallied, it was clear that we'd witnessed the death of the Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force. The numbers were staggering. In 4 days, the Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, nearly half their remaining fleet. More importantly, they lost most of their trained pilots and experienced sailors. The men who'd attacked Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and fought us to a standstill in the Coral Sea, and at Midway were gone, replaced by teenagers with a few months of training. Our own losses, while painful, were manageable. We'd lost 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort, less than 10% of the forces engaged. More critically, our shipyards could replace those losses in a matter of months. The Japanese could never replace what they'd lost. But statistics don't tell the whole story. They don't capture the courage of Commander Ernest Evans and the crew of the Johnston, who charged an entire battle fleet with nothing but 5-inch guns and pure American grit. They don't describe the skill of pilots like Lieutenant Commander Huxtable, who led attack after attack against impossible odds and lived to tell about it. And they don't honor the memory of men like Seaman First Class Billy Thompson, who died of his injuries 2 weeks after we were rescued, but never once complained about his pain. I spent 3 days in a hospital ship before being transferred to a new assignment, another escort carrier, another Bofors gun, another chance to serve. The war would continue for 9 more months, but after Leyte Gulf, we all knew how it would end. The Japanese could still fight, and they would savagely, desperately, with the fury of cornered animals, but they could no longer win. That dream had died with Admiral Kurita's retreating battleships in the waters off the Philippines. I'm an old man now, and most of the boys I served with are gone. Martinez made it through the war, but died young from complications related to his wounds. Huxtable survived to become an airline pilot and lived to be 93. Captain Vug was decorated for his conduct during the battle and went on to command a cruiser in the final assault on Japan. People sometimes ask me if it was worth it, the death, the destruction, the years of our lives lost to war. It's a fair question, and one I thought about for 7 decades. My answer is always the same. Look at the world we left our children. The Japanese militarists who bombed Pearl Harbor and murdered millions of civilians in China and Southeast Asia were stopped. The Nazi regime that built death camps and tried to enslave half the world was crushed. Freedom and democracy, however imperfect, survived to fight another day. That was worth fighting for. That was worth dying for. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval engagement in human history, and it ended with American victory. But victory always comes at a price, paid in the blood of young men who deserve to live long lives, marry their sweethearts, and watch their children grow up. We who survived carry their memory with us, and the obligation to ensure their sacrifice was not in vain. I think about that morning in October 1944 every time I hear the sound of aircraft engines or see a ship on the horizon. I remember the weight of the ammunition in my hands, the smell of cordite and burning oil, the sight of Japanese aircraft falling from the sky like broken birds. Most of all, I remember the men I served with, ordinary Americans who did extraordinary things when history called upon them. The Bofors gun that Thompson, Martinez, and I crewed that morning is long since scrapped. The Gambier Bay lies on the bottom of Leyte Gulf, 17,000 feet down in the cold and dark. But the spirit that drove us to victory, the willingness of free men to fight for something greater than themselves, that endures. It has to. Because somewhere, in some future we cannot imagine, young Americans may be called upon to defend freedom once again. When that day comes, I pray they will show the same courage we found in ourselves on that long-ago morning, when the fate of the world hung in the balance, and a handful of tin can sailors and carrier aircraft held the line against tyranny. The Japanese came at us with the largest, most powerful fleet they had ever assembled. They had every advantage: bigger guns, heavier armor, more experience. They should have crushed us like insects. Instead, we sent them running home, their dreams of empire shattered on the courage of American sailors and the accuracy of Swedish-designed anti-aircraft guns. That's what I want people to remember about Leyte Gulf. Not just the ship sunk or the tonnage lost, but the fact that when evil came calling with overwhelming force, ordinary Americans stood up and said, "No, not today, not ever." And that made all the difference in the world.